many ways, she is today the go-to person, someone who the world is looking up to for leading us out of the troubled times we live in. Welcome to the Raisina Dialogue, President von
Thank
der
you very
Leyen.
much. Thank you for having me.
President, India in the last few years, in some ways has already made up its mind on its future with the EU as a partner. And you know, you just made a big announcement outside on the technology trade deal, which I rightly said is about economy, about security, about individuals. My question to you would be that, do you believe this is the time for us to be ambitious as partners? You see India has a new energy in terms of engaging with Australia on a trade conversation, with the UAE on a FTA. Can EU and India finally do that? Can we move towards a concrete agreement? And how will that benefit the two of us?
Yes. Oh yes, we should be ambitious, and I'm deeply convinced that we will move to a free trade agreement, an investment agreement, and geographical indications. And why that? So first of all, if I look at our two regions, we have so much in common. We are vibrant democracies. We are large economies. We share the same values. And it is very interesting to see, if you look at these large economies, let me give you some figures. The European Union is 20% of the global GDP. Mm-hmm. India is the third largest economy. But if we look at the trade between the two of us, it's small. Mm-hmm. So it's India towards Europe, it's only 2% of the overall European trade. And vice versa, Europe towards India, it's only 11% of the overall Indian trade. There's a huge potential that is untapped, and therefore it is time to work together on that. My second reason for that is we've learned our lesson in the pandemic with the interruption of supply chains, and all of a sudden we all understood dependencies and difficult supply chains. So we want to establish resilient supply chains with a trusted partner, and here one of our most important partners will be India.
President von der Leyen, it's interesting you say that. Many of us at least in the academic community, see this as one of the most important 2 years of global history, at least in the last 100 years. You as a leader of EU, as a global statesman, how would you rate the performance of the world, of world leaders, of the world institutions during the last 2 years? How have they performed? What did we do right? Where did we get it wrong?
So if we look at the COVID pandemic, first of all, what did we get right is the amazing victory of science in developing a vaccine within a year, which takes normally 10 years. And it is interesting to see that all the effective and safe vaccines have been developed in free and open democracies. So freedom of science obviously plays an enormous role. There's a second part where I think we had a very hard time. We were not at all prepared. So the lesson we learned in the European Union, for example, is now to create a health union with institutions like the Americans, who were better prepared with BARDA. We create HERA. And I think there's a third element that is painful. We were not able to manage from the start to have equitable access to the vaccines. And this is also not being prepared for such a pandemic. We've learned the lessons that we now heavily invest through Global Gateway, for example, with our African friends in Senegal, Rwanda, and South Africa, to build up manufacturing capacity for vaccine production. But not only that, also, and this is very important, between India and the European Union, to find a solution on the TRIPS agreement that we make sure that technology, for example, the mRNA technology, is really being transferred, for example, to Africa by compulsory licensing. So we had victories in science, we were not prepared in facing the pandemic, and we have to learn our lessons in equitable access.
What more can India and EU be doing with Africa? We have an old relationship. Europe knows the continent intimately. is it time for us to actually be now working with other geographies, offering together new models of growth, governance, sustainable development, green transitions? Or are we only going to continue to resist offerings of others, criticize them without giving an alternative?
It is in our own interest to engage with Africa and what we are doing already. And let me take the example of the vaccines. India is the pharmacy of the world. You have a long-standing tradition. And here it was thanks also to the impulse of India together with South Africa in the WTO that we now have the compromise that is a good one on the TRIPS agreement. The principle is that indeed we engage through financing, that is our global gateway, but also through knowledge transfer. And there you have a long tradition. So in the vaccine element or the pharmaceutical sector, there is a big role for India. And yes, the second big role for India is shared with the European Union, an investment in fighting climate change with innovation and technologies in Africa. Africa has an abundance of natural resources, sun, wind, geothermal, hydropower. If we use that, for example, also to bring technologies to Africa to produce green hydrogen, this is a complete new story for the global south.
So this was the part that dealt with some of the pressing geoeconomic questions of our time. Let me move to the tougher part now. The Ukraine conflict, you mentioned it in your address, and I think you were quite forthright in how you assess the situation. But it does represent for all of us. You could be anywhere in the world, but it does represent a tectonic moment in global politics. Europe has now an Eastern Front that is unlikely to be stable for a while. We mentioned the 20th century revisited. It is going to consume a lot of political capital in Brussels, in other capitals, also economic investments will be required in this particular situation. Will there be enough room in the strategic space in your part of the world for Ukraine as well as the Indo-Pacific? Or will the Indo-Pacific necessarily have to wait?
I am deeply convinced there is not only enough room, but also the will. Not only to share attention to the very important topic of Ukraine, but also the Indo-Pacific. Because what are we doing in Ukraine? We support Ukraine for core values that we are defending. For example, the territorial integrity and the sovereignty of a country. Its ability to decide what it wants to do in future. We are defending that borders cannot be redrawn by force. The respect for the sovereignty of a country. And these are all topics that are also important for the Indo-Pacific, to be free and open, to be connected, to be resilient, to be a safe place. So the principles we defend, basically principles of the international rules-based order and the UN Charter, the principles we defend are also vital principles for the Indo-Pacific region. And let me give you another very economic argument. 40% of the European Union's trade is going through the South China Sea. So besides the political and diplomatic principles that we are defending there, it's also an economic question.
So let me, with the theme, on Russia, Europe and the EU have shown a resolve, a determination, some steel that many of us wanted Europe to be exhibiting. We all used to cheer for Europe to be more political, more strategic, be a more forceful actor in determining solutions that are fair. You've done that. You've done all of that in the last few months. The question is that why should we, sitting in this part of the world, believe that this European determination and cohesion is sustainable? For example, will an egregious Chinese expansionism in this part of the world in many ways catalyze this kind of a European response? Or is geography the biggest determinant? Put simply, is the European determination for values a European affair, or are we going to see a same vocal, determined and political Europe emerge even in distant conflicts caused by different actors, not necessarily Russia?
So first of all, of course it concerns deeply Europe and Europe's security, because we have seen a brutal invasion from Russia in Ukraine. And I have witnessed with my own eyes, by traveling to Kiev and Bucha, the cruel scars and wounds that Russia committed to innocent civilians in Bucha. But there's more than a European cause, because the unity that you see is shared by many other countries. We have more than 40 countries that are applying the sanctions, our answer to this brutal military invasion, the economic and financial sanctions. So it's a broader unity that is telling very clearly, Russia, don't do this. If there is a conflict, it has to be solved at the negotiation table and not on the battlefield. And this shows that it is a wider topic than only a regional topic. It's a basic principle, a basic question of defending our principled rules and the international order. And therefore, I think this unity will have a lasting effect. It is for us a defining moment whether the democracy with its rules will prevail, or whether autocrats can dominate by the right of might. We want the rules-based order. We want respect for the international rules-based order. And therefore it is so vital, not only for Europe, but all our friends and allies who support us, that this war will be a strategic failure for Russia, and that Ukraine will have its right to be an independent, sovereign country.
Madam President, you mentioned technology a few times in the main speech you made today. Some of us are concerned that we have literally two dominant models in the world today. One is the Silicon Valley model, where you have boardrooms deciding the future of our world. Unaccountable boardrooms many times, but certainly innovative boardrooms nonetheless. The other model is the party headquarters in Beijing deciding the future of our technology, of how it evolves, how we engage with it. Two big models. The GDPR, many would argue, was a muscular European proposition. And by the way, I think many countries around the world are following the GDPR plus minus model. Most of them have a variant of GDPR in their own arrangements now, including what we are currently working on as a data policy in India. Do you believe that as normative powers, Europe and India can actually moderate both these extremes, from unaccountable boardrooms to party headquarters, which are completely unaccountable? Is it time for us to partner to build a new regulatory offering for the world?
Absolutely. And this is the reason why Prime Minister Modi and I agreed on the Trade and Technology Council. Because we have a different approach. This is a human-centric approach. We believe deeply that data, your data, the privacy of your data, should be owned by you and not by a company, and certainly not by a government or a state that is controlling you. You have the right to decide on what happens with your data. And this human-centric approach that puts the individual human being in the center of our philosophy, this is something we share. And therefore it is so important that we develop these rules that are, of course, rules we know in the analog offline world, that we develop this regulation and these rules in the digital world. And two big democracies with 1.8 billion people, like India and the European Union together, have of course an enormous influence because it's a big market. And therefore, if we develop together common rules on our markets, it will shape the world because it will set standards.
Madam President, thank you so much for inaugurating the Raisina dialogue and joining us at this fireside. as a final question, how was your trip to India, and do we see you back again soon?
The trip was fantastic, and there was only one downside. It was too short, and therefore I have to come back, and I would love to come back.
So we'll hold you to that, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.